Half-Life Alyx really has proven to be the gift that keeps on giving. I was having a lot of trouble with this video. I was so excited to go in deep and talk about all of these maps from the contest in detail. What I wasn't mentally prepared for was the utter embarrassment of riches that this contest turned out to be. Trying to play through all of these maps in the span of 4 days while simultaneously starting my new pandemic-friendly job was frankly a horrible idea. Between the threat of motion sickness, headaches from hours spent in VR, messing up my sleep schedule, having to put off all sorts of flat-screen games I've been looking forward to playing, and some more hands-on stuff I've been doing with this very modding community, there were a ton of obstacles to getting this video out on time, but I managed to pull through, all because I wanted to go in depth on each map. What I didn't realize while planning this crazy week for myself, however, was that in a game as feature-light as Half-Life Alyx, there would be a lot of overlap in the best and worst qualities of these levels. And to go over each map in depth would include a whole lot of me just saying the same thing over and over again, just with different backing footage for each repetition. I don't mean to say that these maps all felt samey, but there definitely was some sameness, given that the theme of the contest was simply the Combine's presence, and that there were 22 different maps for me to play through. So rather than look at each map, or even my top 5 favorite maps in depth, we're going to clump the whole set of maps together, treat it as a single experience, and talk about what that experience can teach us about VR game design going forward. However, I know some of you are just watching this to see which maps you should try out in a Steam workshop flooded with joke maps. So for the sake of those viewers, let me just say that my absolute favorite maps from the collection, in no particular order, are Interference by MDD Bulldog, Club 17 by Dorman, Benefactor's Disturbance by Socks, Quick Stop by Yost King, Combine Uni by Everand, Escape the Apartments by I'm Drinking Cocoa, and Overcharge by Higyu. There are definitely other maps that I really liked, but those are the maps that I think you absolutely need to play, full stop. So anyways, on to our next item. I'd like to point out that while the official level editor for Half-Life Alyx is out now, all of these maps were made with the bootleg tools created by the community, and as a result, it's not all that uncommon to see cars with weird hit detection on the windows, strange lighting, cabinets that don't open, and I even saw one resin unit that I couldn't actually use or put in my backpack. Some of these maps have been touched up with the official tools, but as for the rest, I think it's most fair to treat them as betas, even if development isn't necessarily going to continue any further for some of them. I'll absolutely praise fantastic visuals, but we can't judge broken visuals too harshly in this context. One last thing I feel obliged to point out is that my headset, the Vive Cosmos, has absolutely horrible hand tracking, so when you see something like this, don't let it stop your interest in VR or Half-Life Alyx. Things are much smoother on literally any other headset. So, onto that wild frontier of game design that is VR that I like to talk about so much. Unfortunately, I feel compelled to start this video out on a negative that I didn't think of until this contest. I think that this should be written on a sticky note on every single VR game developer's monitor. Uneven floors equal motion sickness. While I'm particularly prone to motion sickness, I haven't had any, and I mean any, problems with VR after my first 2 or 3 days of playing in it. That was until I played some of the maps from this contest. We all love the Zen Flora aesthetic. It's gross and creepy and really atmospheric. But if you need to make your floors bumpy to accommodate this aesthetic, you need to start implementing some workarounds. The camera moving up and down as I traversed bumpy, Zen-infested floors was the first thing that's ever made me have to cut a VR play session short and go lay down for a bit. One simple thing you could do to alleviate this would be to make these displacements or models not collide with the player, then put a flat floor underneath the displacement that we do collide with. After all, we can't see Alyx's legs. Now, I haven't got the first idea how to use the Hammer map editor, so rather than subject you to MS Paint diagrams, I'm just going to use Gary's mod to show you what I'm talking about. You see this bumpy piece of floor right here? This is a displacement. It's just a type of surface that you can dynamically add bumps and potholes to. As you can see, when I walk over this, my camera goes up and down. This isn't really a problem in a flat screen game, but in VR, it's a recipe for disaster. So imagine instead if we made it so that the player wasn't actually affected by this floor, and we instead have an invisible, perfectly flat floor underneath that the player was truly walking on. Then we could walk across bumpy floors like this, and this is what it would look like. No variation in the camera's height, and we all get to keep our lunch. I'd imagine it's difficult for VR developers to put themselves in the shoes of someone who's more susceptible to VR sickness, but that's just one of the many challenges of VR game design. So, with that major warning out of the way, let's move on to a happier lesson, one which is perfectly summarized by looking at Everand's map, Combine Uni. The player is your best source of comedy, and they're a prop comic. This one actually applies to flat screen games too, but there are some tricks that a VR game designer can use to capitalize on this fact. If you set up a comedic tone in your mod, you're silently telling players that it's okay to goof off a bit. Combine Uni established this comedic tone immediately with its name, but then it just furthered it by showing me this silly display cabinet, only to have me get ambushed by a Combine grunt who probably thought I was a total idiot. Well, once I dispatched them with great dispatch, I went back to look at this display and I found a friendly little rat. This quickly led to this. This is exactly the stuff I'm talking about. The map told me it was comedic, and so I naturally caught myself doing funny things and ending up in funny situations. This, in turn, put me in an even sillier mindset, and so I was even more open to comedic stuff. The glitch in this clip would have pissed me off in any other setting, but because this mod had me in such a comedic mood, it was actually the hardest I'd ever laughed in the game, at least up until this fantastic ending to Benefactor's Disturbance by Socks. Benefactor's Disturbance actually used the opposite method for comedy. It was basically the only joke in the map as far as I know. It set me up with this fantastic sense of momentum as I just tore through the Combine, and then after one particularly hard fight, I opened up this door to find my fate sealed. The sheer panic of seeing this is something that couldn't really be brought across in a flat screen game. It even plays off the classic Half-Life trope of a room filled with lasers, one which this very map used earlier. If you're aiming for blunt, unexpected comedy, you can't get much better than this moment. Low-tier weapons doesn't have to equal low-tier combat. In my last video on custom Half-Life Alyx maps, I talked about how tiresome it was to go through every map with totally unupgraded weapons, and maybe finding enough resin to get 1 or 2 low-tier upgrades. Well, looking at the excellent police station raid by Kuna, we see that there's another way to make the player feel like a badass, and let them take down tons of enemies without needing upgrades to their weapons. There are 2 main ways that it does this. Firstly, we fight a ton of grunts in the beginning, who are easy as hell to kill and super aggressive in pushing us. And secondly, it gives you plenty of shotgun ammo. The effect of this is that we feel like we can afford to be super aggressive, because if we ever do have to duck down to reload, we have plenty of shells loaded in our shotgun to take down enemies who breach our cover. When grunts are rushing you, they aren't shooting. That, combined with the way that this car door is open, means that we can confidently shoot at these approaching grunts with our pistol, and we'll see when they get close enough that we need to pull out our shotgun, and make sure they either keep their distance or drop dead. Again, we have unupgraded weapons, but thanks to the elegance with which this combat encounter was designed, we can feel like a real badass in spite of that fact. I'll admit though, I might be a bit biased in favor of this map because it was the first one I played on medium difficulty, whereas I'd been on hard for all of the prior maps. Regardless of that, the way that this encounter design encourages a more aggressive playstyle is such a breath of fresh air when most of the other maps I've played had you hiding behind cover so much more. Moving forward, we got access to the police station's armory, and as fantastic as this moment was, it would have been great if this map gave me a fully upgraded Pulse SMG rather than a stock one. It gives you so much more ammo for the SMG than we usually get, so being able to use the extended magazine mod would have been fantastic. The final fight on this map is where we really get to use the Pulse SMG to its fullest. This particular encounter actually encouraged me to use the SMG to force these approaching shotgunners to deploy their shields, giving me time to run past them and get shotgun hits on them from behind, since they couldn't attack. Moving forward into this fight, we get to one final section that, as exciting as it was, sort of felt like a letdown with the momentum that the rest of the map had me on. Suddenly, it was about waiting behind cover, whereas if the SMG had come fully upgraded, I would have had more freedom to fire blindly from cover, and that, combined with a couple more grenades, would have given me the liberty to control the pace of this fight a bit more, as I had with the earlier encounters that I loved so much. In short, unupgraded weapons can be used in high-octane fights, but you need the level and encounter design to back it up, and if you are doing this and omitting resin collecting, it wouldn't hurt to reward the player's perseverance with unupgraded weapons by giving them a fully upgraded weapon before the final fight. So you don't necessarily need to start me out with a ton of resin if you want to have the most intense combat, you just need the level and encounter design to encourage aggression from both the player and the enemy. Don't be afraid to encourage retreating. While there are lots of examples of Combine encounters that you can get through just by sticking to your cover and attacking everyone who gets close in between blows on distant support enemies, these are generally lower tier fights that you might find in earlier phases of your map. For a fittingly challenging final battle, a little bit of retreating by the player is sort of inevitable. If the player is low on health, they're going to be much more cautious and trying to take out the enemies one at a time in a super methodical way. Retreating draws them out of cover and gives you this opportunity. However, as we see in this fantastic final battle from Overcharge by Higyu, the decision to retreat can actually be much more interesting and a much more tactical decision if you have the level design to back it up. This fight is tough, especially on hard mode. You're going to desperately want more grenades, and you will absolutely be retreating to give yourself some more time once this first shotgunner appears and breaches your feeble cover. You can use the Pulse SMG to force him to deploy his shield, thus giving you time to escape. But more than that, you'll quickly notice that there are all sorts of gaps through which you can see enemies that lie ahead of you, deep into the enemy side of the arena. This, of course, gives you the opportunity to attack them from a much more advantageous angle, but that means that they can attack you too. Rather than being a mindless response to danger, as it is in many other firefights, retreating is actually a much more tactical decision in this arena. The danger is, in a unique way, coming from both sides. Retreating makes you vulnerable to different enemies than holding your ground does, so you have to be very careful about when and how you do it, especially when you're taking on this Combine commander in the final stage of the first phase of this encounter. Your map design is the foundation that you build your encounter design off of, and an arena like this presents much more interesting challenges than a simple piece of cover with enemies on the other side of it. This brings me to lesson number 5. Make your firefights as unique as possible. Let's face it, Half-Life Alyx can get a tad repetitive, which is why I encouraged giving us high tier upgrades right off the bat in my previous video on Alyx. This contest in particular was again themed after the Combine's presence, so there were a lot of Combine encounters in these maps. Things like that final arena I praised from Overcharge, and that parking garage fight I praised from Police Station Raid are fantastic examples of mixing things up in your fight. But for me, the firefight that took the cake was actually, according to the creator, an unintended consequence of the way I went about playing through Cranial Femur's map, Contact Confirmed. See, I was immediately thinking I needed to conserve ammo, so I only bothered taking down one of these zombies in the beginning. When I opened this door, I quickly found myself in this arena with a Combine suppressor up top suppressing me, and 2 or 3 grunts on ground level trying to breach my cover. This is a fairly standard Half-Life Alyx situation, but because I let those zombies in the beginning live, they followed me out into this arena, putting me in a very sticky situation, where ranged enemies were advancing on me from one direction, and melee enemies were advancing on me from the other direction. As a result of this, I had to move as much as I could, which required paying close attention to every Combine soldier, and slightly less close attention to every zombie. And this led to me actually using the Combine suppressor to my advantage, coaxing him into taking down the zombies for me, giving me a bit more breathing room. Of course, the negative consequence to this strategy was that there were now head crabs coming for me, which are much faster and much more difficult to stay away from than zombies. It was a really interesting and unique firefight, and that simple bit of emergent gameplay was actually one of the highlights of this whole contest for me. There was also a fantastic moment in the highly atmospheric Escape the Apartments by I'm Drinking Coca. It was my first firefight against the Combine, and it took place in this classic Half-Life 2 style environment, which was loaded with precariously placed explosive tanks, which could be used to send debris toppling down onto the Combine standing below. As a little anecdote, I had another mapper ask me for suggestions for his next map, and I told him that taking inspiration from the original Half-Life 2 reveal event would make for a great time in VR. Using physics to kill unsuspecting Combine without just using the gravity gun, and this is exactly what this firefight in Escape the Apartments delivered, and I wasn't disappointed at all. The creator even tells me that you can stealth your way through this section, which is cool and all, but with all of these explosive barrels here, I couldn't help but go in guns blazing. It was a great time, and it was memorable, and that's all because it was unique. Stress is a great thing. Lastly, I want to talk about what is probably my favorite encounter in the entire contest, the finale to Quickstop by Yost King. The final fight of this map takes place on the roof of the map's namesake, the Quickstop gas station. During this fight, there was just a single Combine suppressor on an opposing roof a decent distance away, but there was so much combat going on between the soldiers actually getting onto the roof with me, the grunts constantly throwing grenades my way from street level, and manhacks disturbing my timing, that I wasn't able to take down the suppressor for the longest time. In other words, the suppressor was fulfilling his role perfectly, even from this super aggressive position. And as a result of so many constant threats, every time I noticed a new enemy had made it onto the roof I was fighting from, I thought to myself, this is going to be the one that kills me. And yet somehow, by really being careful with my positioning, I was able to survive this entire encounter on my first attempt, even on hard. There wasn't 1 second of this fight's middle section where I wasn't convinced I was going to be dead in a couple seconds, but I kept doing my best, and somehow I managed to stay alive, even with that suppressor keeping my nose in the dirt, and the manhacks, grenades, and pushing soldiers trying to encourage me to get up and run. This was an incredibly stressful fight, but I managed to pull through, and it was just a fantastic feeling. This is absolutely top tier encounter design, the kind that I've hardly seen matched outside of Metal Gear Solid 3 and Half-Life 1. So let's talk about an easier and more universal way to put the player in an exciting and stressful situation. The very first map I played was the funny and empowering Shakedown by Johnny. The first Combine encounter in this level has you hiding behind a luggage cart, where your only cover is physics objects which can be quickly knocked away by Combine attacks. My cover was constantly degrading, meaning that I was heavily motivated to take down these enemies as quickly as I could, a task which was made easier by the grenade dropped by this first oblivious Combine grunt. This was also attempted in that fantastic physics objects fight from Escape the Apartments that I mentioned earlier. You might have even seen it in my footage. This wall was designed to break apart if shot enough. However, in my conversations with Coca, the map's creator, he confessed that he never quite got it right, and the wall was way sturdier than he intended. Still, I think it's hard to not fall in love with that John McClane, ramshackle firefight feeling you get from hiding behind an absolutely pathetic piece of cover, which couldn't possibly hold up to enemy attacks for more than a few seconds. It's really exciting stuff. I could go on to talk about lighting and visual design in VR, the way that the 3D puzzles can be used to add pacing to maps, emerging gameplay, VR narrative design, exploration, resin and ammo placement, or of course, horror elements, but I think I'll leave that for you all to discover as you play through these maps for yourself, and get to see some of this stuff with your own two eyes. In the meantime, I just want to give thanks to the Half-Life Alyx modding Discord once again for creating this contest, and motivating so many of these creators to really bring their best foot forward, and resultantly giving us an absolute wealth of examples to draw from when talking about Half-Life Alyx's design in particular, and VR game design in general. I've gotten to know some of these creators a bit more. I've even been recruited as a playtester for something I'll talk about more in the future, and the passion on display speaks for itself. I unfortunately didn't get to mention all of these maps by name, but I'm showing off some of my favorite things about them on screen now. These guys aren't getting paid for this, they're just doing it out of love for the game, so they absolutely deserve to get some love back. For a lot of these people, this contest was their first step in becoming mappers, and I can't state clearly enough how excited I am to see what all of this leads to for them. Some of these guys absolutely have what it takes to be professionals in this department, and they're only going to get better as time goes on. As I said before, Half-Life Alyx is the gift that keeps on giving.